Welcome to Eerie Echoes. Tonight we descend into the heart of the Appalachians, America's oldest and most enigmatic range, to unearth 8 true horror stories whispered through its valleys for generations. These aren't campfire tales. They're first-hand accounts, from hunters who realized they weren't alone, to abandoned cabins hiding secret rituals, to campers who lost days and returned changed. Some names and locations have been altered to protect survivors, but the terror at the core remains. If you're new here, subscribe to Eerie Echoes for daily true horror content, and brace yourself for the dark. Shortcuts in these mountains are rarely about distance. They are about decisions. I learned that the day the forest offered me a guide, and for reasons I still can't defend, I accepted. I started that section of the Appalachian Trail with the kind of confidence that comes from a completed degree and a body tuned by long miles. The first 2 days were textbook. White blazes at dependable intervals, a dapple of sun through beech and oak, switchbacks that rose like patient arguments. The Blue Ridge felt older than the Rockies I knew. The hills carried a weight that didn't threaten so much as insist. In that insistence, I slept well, warmed morning coffee in a titanium mug, and felt that I had the measure of the place. On the third morning, the electronics quit as one body. The GPS offered a blank screen. The power bank registered full but acted like a stone. The phone was only a mirror. I told myself it was fine. Compass, map, muscle memory. Around mid-morning, I stopped at a clearing to check bearings. The trail remained obvious. The white blaze clean and square on the nearest tree. The next one ghosting further down the slope. Everything aligned until the forest rearranged itself around a man. He stepped from the understory as though the mountain had sent him. Faded camouflage, a flannel shirt taken by thorns, long hair gathered in a quick knot. His presence carried the confidence of someone born to a map only he could see. He named peaks I could verify, warned of a washed-out section I had circled hours earlier, described a ridge with a view that matched the topo lines as neatly as if he'd drawn them himself. He called what he offered a better way, not a secret trail, merely the real one, the one that existed before paint. I followed because knowledge is a passport, and he stamped mine with every detail he named. The path he took began as a logging road and then unthreaded into faint suggestion. Ferns repaired the ruts. Saplings closed ranks where tires once chewed. He walked without the fuss of someone tracking a line. He simply moved where the woods made space for him. He pointed to deer sign and bear scat, named an edible plant, and showed the way its stem should snap if you were going to trust it. His talk turned to families who stayed in these hollows out of preference, not poverty, to minds that dove down so far you could unspool a question and never hear it hit bottom, to the kind of men who disliked outsiders the way weather dislikes plans. Time lifted its edges and hours slid underneath. We saw none of the landmarks I'd been promised. The sun thinned behind green, and the grade began to lie, upturning to over, the compass needle flicking as if the mountain had a thought about direction. The road collapsed into the general fact of woods, and only then did I understand how far we'd come from certainty. I do not know when I first knew we were not alone. It arrived as glimpses, a branch rebounding where wind had not moved, the quieted fall of something soft through leaf litter, a pause that wasn't mine. The feeling congealed into fact when the woods answered themselves with a thin, efficient whistle, answered from a second place, then a third. The man's pace didn't change. His shoulders did. I asked to check the map and stepped behind a wide oak whose roots had pried up a shale slab like a tilted door. Behind the trunk, the forest made the sound I had been waiting for. Bodies correcting to movement. I ran. Running off trail is a conversation with gravity where you do too much of the talking. Vines choose your ankles, branches collect a blood tax. The hill said no, then maybe, then not yet, then suddenly yes, and the shoulder of the ridge lifted underfoot. I aimed for elevation because blazes live up high and sightlines lengthen where wind has work to do. The whistles fanned out and tightened. Shouting tried my name on its teeth. The forest's vocabulary became instruction: breath, foot, grip, release. The white blaze, when it came, was the only clean geometry I'd seen in an hour. I nearly cried at paint. I touched it as though the tree were a person and then moved from mark to mark, counting them like prayer beads, the pattern stitching me back into a world that had rules. The sun went and the headlamp replaced it. Beam to rectangle, rectangle to beam. A chain made of light and intention. Sometime near midnight, the trail crossed a road like a vein crossing bone, and I stood in its yellow lines the way a drowning person stands in a doorway he has finally reached. The first car to stop belonged to a sheriff's deputy whose face said he had rescued more than one hiker dressed in bramble and fear. He listened while I put sentences together with hands that shook. He did not ask for descriptions I couldn't provide. He did not tell me I had imagined the coordinated whistles. He told me there were names in the county S files and a section of trail where people went missing at a rate the mountain didn't bother to explain. In the motel mirror, I looked like a map had revised me. Sleep came the way a tide comes when the moon is finished arguing. In the morning, the deputy's words sat in my pack heavier than water. I could have written the incident up to bad luck and worse judgment. Instead, I added a new rule to the small list I carry. When the forest offers help, ask who collects the debt. I still walk, but I lace my boots with a different attention. I watch the woods the way you watch a dog whose tail is wagging and whose ears are back. I practice saying no to friendliness with good topography. In these mountains, predators seldom show their teeth. They prefer to show you a shortcut. I was never lost that day. I was misplaced by intention. That was the lesson the Blue Ridge taught me. Nothing hunts louder than kindness with a map. Enjoying the stories? Don't forget to subscribe to Eerie Echoes so you don't miss what's waiting deeper in the range. Some inheritances settle with a handshake at a lawyer's office. Mine arrived in a wooden chest under a bed, written in my grandfather's hand. A feeding schedule, a map, and a promise the mountain would come to collect if I failed. Serpent's Gap was never on the way to anywhere. The road decided against pavement 10 miles back and then argued with itself until it was barely the width of my car. The cabin stood as if patience were a form of architecture, logs silvered to an even gray, a stone chimney straight as a verdict, a porch with boards polished by feet I knew and feet I didn't. Inside smelled of old wood and lamp oil. The lawyer had called it abandoned, but abandonment doesn't stack canned peaches by expiration date or hang a familiar flannel on a nail by the door. The chest slid from under the bed with a sound that carried across years. Photographs came first, groups shrinking over time until only one man remained at the center, jaw set the way mine is when I am doing something I don't want to and intend to do anyway. Letters followed, their edges softened by hands that had been uncertain where to send them. And then the journals, thick and practical. Not mystical at all, page after page of rules about a place called the Mouth. He wrote like a man who had learned the cost of imprecision. The offering must be fresh and from the land. Never use salt. Never go twice in a week no matter how loud the calling song becomes. Wrap the parcel with care. Leave it without waiting. Walk out on your own prints. He noted the month his cousin failed his duty and the month the cousin's car was found empty on a shoulder 2 counties away. He didn't claim cause, He recorded sequence, which is sometimes the same thing when you live long enough beside a hungry fact. The map was specific in a way that only experience can be. Start from the porch. Follow the creek upstream until it lowers its voice. Past the whaleback stone. Past the twin poplars lightning split one July. Climb until the laurel stops and the ground forgets what green means. There you will find a stand of trees that should be alive and are not. In the center, a shallow depression that resists being called a hole. That is the mouth. He never described teeth. He didn't need to. I read until the lamp's shadow trembled on the wall. Somewhere after midnight, the air outside drew itself into a tone. It wasn't music so much as a suggestion of it. The way a held note lives in a violin's body after the bow has moved on. It moved around the cabin like a patient inspection. If I had not read the word-calling song, I might have called it wind. Words name things into an honesty you cannot return from. At dawn, the journals felt heavier, as if the pages absorbed decision. I packed the offering with my hands and my reluctance, folded the map until it was a square of intention, and tied my boots while the coffee boiled in a tin that could not care less what I was about to do. The creek accepted me at stones whose slick memorized my weight. The whaleback was exactly where your mind would put it if your mind had been born here. The poplars stood like two statements no one was brave enough to retract. Beyond them, the laurel thinned until it was simply gone, and the ground lost interest in supporting anything above the height of a stubborn weed. In that dead stand, time slid its ring off. Sound dulled. My breath forgot to fog. The depression was no more than a shallow bowl in a skin of earth darkened to a color that wasn't quite ash and wasn't quite soil. I laid the parcel at the center without ceremony because ceremony felt like an invitation to be noticed. The air thickened as if the place had taken a sip of it, and a bass of vibration rose through my boot soles, a recognition, not a thank you. The calling song pressed gently on the inside of my skull and let go. I left the way I had come, heel to toe inside my own prints, trying to be the kind of animal a place will tolerate. Back at the cabin, the coffee tasted like coffee, which felt like mercy. On the final page, my grandfather's handwriting shook a little. He had kept the schedule for longer than most men keep anything. He had run out of time, not conviction. He had left the land to me because I was, in his words, the one most likely to keep a promise I had not made. I thought about selling. A timber company would pay. The taxes would vanish. The problem would become someone else's. But the journals were not vague. The hungry thing was not particular about lines on paper or names on deeds. The promise did not follow owners. It followed the mouth. I drove out under laurel that bloomed white and pink as if the hollow were celebrating. That is how the mountains tell jokes. I come back when the calendar tells me to. I bring what the rules allow and nothing more. I never whistle. Not all altars are built of stone. Some are kept on a schedule written in a family hand, and the mountain only wants proof that you remember. If this left a mark, tap subscribe to Eerie Echoes. We descend further next time. Some inheritances settle with a handshake at a lawyer's office. Mine arrived in a wooden chest under a bed, written in my grandfather's hand. A feeding schedule, a map, and a promise the mountain would come to collect if I failed. Serpent's Gap was never on the way to anywhere. The road decided against pavement 10 miles back and then argued with itself until it was barely the width of my car. The cabin stood as if patience were a form of architecture, logs silvered to an even gray, a stone chimney straight as a verdict, a porch with boards polished by feet I knew and feet I didn't. Inside smelled of old wood and lamp oil. The lawyer had called it abandoned, but abandonment doesn't stack canned peaches by expiration date or hang a familiar flannel on a nail by the door. The chest slid from under the bed with a sound that carried across years. Photographs came first, groups shrinking over time until only one man remained at the center, jaw set the way mine is when I am doing something I don't want to and intend to do anyway. Letters followed, their edges softened by hands that had been uncertain where to send them. And then the journals, thick and practical. Not mystical at all, page after page of rules about a place called the Mouth. He wrote like a man who had learned the cost of imprecision. The offering must be fresh and from the land. Never use salt. Never go twice in a week no matter how loud the calling song becomes. Wrap the parcel with care. Leave it without waiting. Walk out on your own prints. He noted the month his cousin failed his duty, and the month the cousin SS car was found empty on a shoulder 2 counties away. He didn't claim cause, he recorded sequence, which is sometimes the same thing when you live long enough beside a hungry fact. The map was specific in a way that only experience can be. Start from the porch. Follow the creek upstream until it lowers its voice. Pass the whaleback stone. Past the twin poplars lightning split 1 July. Climb until the laurel stops and the ground forgets what green means. There you will find a stand of trees that should be alive and are not. In the center, a shallow depression that resists being called a hole. That is the mouth. He never described teeth. He didn't need to. I read until the lamp's shadow trembled on the wall. Somewhere after midnight, the air outside drew itself into a tone. It wasn't music, so much as a suggestion of it, the way a held note lives in a violin's body after the bow has moved on. It moved around the cabin like a patient inspection. If I had not read the word calling song, I might have called it wind. Words name things into an honesty you cannot return from. At dawn, the journals felt heavier, as if the pages absorbed decision. I packed the offering with my hands and my reluctance, folded the map until it was a square of intention, and tied my boots while the coffee boiled in a tin that could not care less what I was about to do. The creek accepted me at stones, whose slick memorized my weight. The whaleback was exactly where your mind would put it if your mind had been born here. The poplars stood like 2 statements no one was brave enough to retract. Beyond them, the laurel thinned until it was simply gone, and the ground lost interest in supporting anything above the height of a stubborn weed. In that dead stand, time slid its ring off. Sound dulled. My breath forgot to fog. The depression was no more than a shallow bowl in the skin of earth darkened to a color that wasn't quite ash and wasn't quite soil. I laid the parcel at the center without ceremony because ceremony felt like an invitation to be noticed. The air thickened as if the place had taken a sip of it, and a bass of vibration rose through my boot soles, a recognition, not a thank you. The calling song pressed gently on the inside of my skull and let go. I left the way I had come, heel to toe inside my own prints, trying to be the kind of animal a place will tolerate. Back at the cabin, the coffee tasted like coffee, which felt like mercy. On the final page, my grandfather's handwriting shook a little. He had kept the schedule for longer than most men keep anything. He had run out of time. Not conviction. He had left the land to me because I was, in his words, the one most likely to keep a promise I had not made. I thought about selling. A timber company would pay. The taxes would vanish. The problem would become someone else's. But the journals were not vague. The hungry thing was not particular about lines on paper or names on deeds. The promise did not follow owners. It followed the mouth. I drove out under laurel that bloomed white and pink as if the hollow were celebrating. That is how the mountains tell jokes. I come back when the calendar tells me to. I bring what the rules allow and nothing more. I never whistle. Not all altars are built of stone. Some are kept on a schedule written in a family hand, and the mountain only wants proof that you remember. If this left a mark, tap subscribe to Eerie Echoes. We descend further next time. My watch said Thursday, 9:47 p.m., the last precise minute of a life that still made sense. When I came back to myself, the light said Sunday afternoon, my feet were bleeding, and the trees around me had died in a perfect circle. I chose the Smokies because order felt far away, and I wanted to meet myself again without anyone watching. Backcountry permits, bear canister, stove, map, redundancies nested inside redundancies. 4 miles from the trailhead, the world narrowed to trail and bird song and the clean arithmetic of miles. The campsite was a postage stamp of flat ground above a stream that talked to itself in small, sane sentences. I boiled water, ate, read with a headlamp, until the first moths began to inspect the beam. It was the most ordinary kind of peace. I counted the stars the way I count breaths when I need to clear the desk inside my head. The watch told me the time, and I told myself I would wake before dawn to take the ridge in cool air. Memory ends there. Not softly, not even abruptly. It just stops in the middle of a normal act and refuses to own what happens next. I woke on my back in a stand of dead trees. Bark peeled like paper scorched, but not burned. The ground in the center of the grove had an oily sheen that resisted light. My boots were gone. My socks were feral with debris and red where skin had given up protest. The clothes I had chosen for Thursday morning were still on my body, filth newly woven into their threads. The air tasted like a suggestion of something metallic, and then like nothing at all. Orientation is a ritual. I performed it because muscle memory needs work when the mind cannot help. I checked pockets. The compass stuttered and spun. I checked the sky. The sun sat in the wrong place for the hour I felt, which was meaningless because feeling had parted company with fact. I tried to reconstruct the route to camp by feature, the fold of slope, the voice of water, the shape of a notch I had passed through with the satisfaction that comes when map and terrain kiss. Everything I recognized stood 2 degrees left of where it should have been. The grove did not want me. That much I understood. I left it by choosing the ugliest line out, downhill through blowdowns and briars, until the stream found me by temperature more than sound. I followed water because it is honest. It goes down. Hours lost their edges. Hunger came on like a thought I had decided not to have. The forest, which I had always loved for its order under the noise, felt as if someone had shaken the box and set the pieces back slightly wrong. When the voice called my name, it came from behind a uniform I had been trained to trust since childhood. A ranger stepped out from behind a screen of hemlock with the calm of someone trained for the exact moment my eyes could not hold. I do not remember words, only the cadence of instruction and the gravity of a hand steadying an elbow that had forgotten simple agreements. The Ranger ES radio confirmed what my watch would later. I had been gone since Friday morning. My campsite had been found intact. The absence of struggle was complete and therefore its own kind of struggle. The hospital reassembled me into measurements. Blood panels searched for the chemicals we know to name and found none. Needles had visited both arms. The punctures had sealed into tiny, neat lies. Along my scalp, under hair, lines the length of commas had been inscribed and closed. A doctor traced one with a gloved finger and then met my eyes with the practiced expression of someone obligated to say, inconclusive, while meaning something else entirely. Night resumed its work the following week, but it did not bring sleep. It brought scenes lit from above by a light not interested in comfort, metal tables with restraint points that had not been introduced as such, corridors that bent at angles that made math feel like an opinion. I remembered being moved, not carried. I remembered hands that performed tasks without commentary. The voices in those rooms were ordinary in the way machines are ordinary, a pitch consistent, an effect void of hurry. I could not lay those rooms in the national park. I could not lay them anywhere I had access to. I knew that denial is a form of order. I also knew the body carries minutes the mind refuses. I tested my gear the way I had always tested it. The GPS booted to a map of a coastline I had never seen, and then corrected to my street with an embarrassed blink. My phone's compass spun once, caught north, and then sighed back to apathy. The watch I had trusted froze twice in the same night at 3:17, and then resumed as if nothing had passed. None of those anomalies would survive a lab note. All of them would live under my tongue when I tried to say the word hike out loud. The park filed my story where such stories go. The form offered boxes. I checked the ones that made the least trouble. The ranger who had found me called weeks later to confirm I was healing and to remind me that the mountains could be disorienting for even the most experienced backpackers. I agreed because everybody needs a sentence they can live inside. The truer sentence has no utility. I was missing for 3 days. I continued to occupy. I do not go back. That is less a rule than a refusal to test an answer I cannot survive knowing. The grove visits sometimes when I am between states of sleep, the dead trees making a circle that is also a clock. The oily soil takes light and gives back only shape. Somewhere beyond the last frame of that memory, a room exists, clean and cold, where something is continuing a project that began long before me and has no intention of ending when I stop looking. People like to say the woods took me. The truth is quieter. Something kept me and returned me changed in ways that do not show up on scans. If these accounts keep you checking the dark, remember to subscribe to Eerie Echoes. We'll go deeper into the mountains next time. Storms in the Blue Ridge do not simply arrive, they decide. When the sky turned to green I had no name for, I made the mistake every wanderer makes once. I let weather choose my shelter. I had spent the morning photographing an abandoned homestead, the kind of place that looks like it remembers names. The plan was to beat the rain back to camp, filter water, and sort the day's images with the slow pleasure of someone who believes he owns his hours. The first wind warned me otherwise. It came like a freight line tunneling through the trees. Then the temperature fell so sharply it felt as if the mountain had held its breath. The sky pressed dark from west to east, not gray, not honest, but a crowded color, bruised and loud. When the first drops hit, they struck like thrown gravel. Leaf litter lifted in sheets, branches moved in sudden coordinated gestures. I saw smoke from a chimney slip up through transitional air and chose it because I wanted survival to be simple. The cabin sat above a cut in the hillside. Porch tilted slightly from seasons, windows yellowed with taped newsprint that bled headlines into the soft light. The door held iron locks stacked like arguments. I knocked because ritual still mattered, and in a moment the locks spoke to each other and the door opened onto warmth, lamplight, and a face that looked like the weather had tried to sculpt it and halfway succeeded. I was ushered inside with the inevitability of any traveler who looks like trouble only to himself. The interior seemed ordinary enough to disarm. A fire held the center of the room, as if the room had been built around it. Furniture had been made by hands that understood the grammar of wood. Jars along a shelf held dry goods, and the tea I was given tasted bitter with a medicinal afterthought I told myself belonged to mountain herbs. The wallpaper, where it remained, had a pattern that reminded me of a childhood kitchen, which is how traps work. They distract with memory. The trophies came into focus the way truth does when you stop letting comfort steer the eye. At first I read them as deer and bear, the usual, the expected. Then scales slipped. The antlers were wrong. The teeth were wrong. I kept looking because that is the job of a camera even when you are not holding it. In the flicker of oil lamps, I began to see human work not as craftsmanship, but as harvest. Pelts that were not pelts. Skulls altered to look like something they never were. Strings of braids with scalps still attached like a terrible insistence that hair is proof of ownership. The windows were boarded from outside. The locks on the door were heavy on the inside. Hospitality rearranged itself into custody. The family moved in the margins first. A man whose height and gauntness made him look like winter even in summer. Younger bodies that carried the marks of kin too close to itself for too long. Eyes too bright in lamplight, attention like a held breath. They did not speak and did not need to. Space adjusted around me as if furniture had learned to herd. The weather lashed the house in sheets, and the notion of leaving became less a choice than an argument I could not win with my legs alone. Fear narrows a vision unless you teach it to widen. I inventoried the room, the line of oil lamps, the thinness of the doorframe, where long use had asked too much of wood, the proximity of the fire to the wool rug, the angle to the porch, if I could shift the hinges from persuasion to compliance. The man stood between me and the exit as if he had grown there. A narrow strip of floor beyond his shoulder looked like the only mathematics that would save me. The tea slowed my hands. The storm took the roof in both palms and shook. Escape, in the end, is logistics. The fire provided a weapon, the lamp a multiplication. When the room's attention swung 5 degrees away, thunder will do that. I moved the way a photograph moves through a printer slot. Controlled, committed, no second chances. A burning stick can be both signal and persuasion. The nearest lamp became a line of flame across floorboards that had been asking to carry a secret. Smoke rose with the fast intelligence of old wood. The doorframe surrendered when force argued with age. The storm received me without grace, but with a kind of justice that felt like air after lack of it. I do not remember the descent to the road with any detail I'd trust. Night covered the mountain with a thickness that made the beam of my headlamp feel like insult. The rain searched my eyes for reasons. I ran until the wind forgot my name. The cabin behind me became first a noise, then a smear of light, then nothing at all. In town, the motel's carpet saturated the room with a smell that insisted on safety. Sleep arrived like a punishment delayed. I thought often afterward about what the family had built out there that the county hadn't noticed or had chosen not to. Economies of survival make sense when you are not a guest. The storm was a delivery system, the cabin a mouth with good manners. I had been lucky, not skilled, not clever. Lucky, and then gone. There are houses the weather prefers because they help it finish a job. If a storm ever chooses for you, choose again. Some tunnels collapse. Others are held up by memory and money. The mine I entered had both, and it had a purpose no reclamation report would ever write down. My contract was straightforward. Assess Eastern Kentucky's abandoned coal works for structural integrity. The checklist was familiar. Timber sets, roof spalls, air readings, water incursion, animal sign. Then I reached the portal that had been tidied against nature. Vegetation had been cut back in a neat scarf. Conduit ran from a generator pad into darkness. The first length of drift was lit with work lights that had been installed by someone who knew the difference between temporary and permanent. Professionalism answered first. I logged coordinates, photographed the setup, tested air. Oxygen held elegant at normal. Methane napped where it usually wakes. I called no one because I told myself I was safer inside figuring than outside fretting. The floor had been graded. The timbers were not old. Side headings that would have slumped had been fitted with steel doors whose weight argued against the modest budget of a county inspection. The whole place carried the careful arrogance of a facility that expected to be used again tomorrow. The main chamber revealed itself the way a stage does when the curtain lifts without applause. Stainless tables kept a kind of hospital silence in light that refused to pretend it was underground. I began to understand that rock is a keeper of secrets only for those who do not plan properly. The documents were not organized to be pretty. They were organized to be found by people who already knew what to look for. The oldest dates belong to the 1940s, papers with stamps and signatures whose acronyms would be familiar to anyone who has read the alphabet of American projects that grew teeth when no one paid attention. The middle years handed operations from government to contractors and then to entities, so abstract the paper itself looked tired. The newest files were crisp and current. Names had been redacted poorly, as if secrecy were a habit no one bothered to perform well anymore. Photographs lay among the forms and made the forms feel like lies. People looked back at me with eyes dulled by drugs, or by the kind of despair that mutes itself to survive the hour. Scars showed along scalps and forearms. Labels on trays used the language of protocols, not care. Sound in minds travel strangely. Voices from deeper in the heading felt nearer than my own breath. 3 people, I guessed. The rhythms of logistics rather than conversation. Timelines mentioned, arrivals scheduled, numbers married to treatments that had nothing to do with healing. The subject was not a sample. The subject would have been me if time had been less kind. I moved because motion was the only gift left. Further in, doors opened on rooms that did not belong in a mine. An office with a calendar that matched the month. A closet with scrubs folded to meet standards no soil could justify. A row of cells welded from industrial materials that reflect both light and intention. In several, people were present, their eyes both distant and painfully aware. The rock had listened to too much here. The decision was a cliff. Leave now with evidence and the ability to bring someone who could bring someone. Stay and count bodies, count rooms, count any last names that might appear on the labels of personal effects, knowing that a count without an exit plan is just a number pinned to a report no one completes because you are not there to complete it. I took photographs like a machine, wide, close index frames with reference points, and then pulled myself back through light until the work lights became points and the conduit was all there was of the place. The sun outside felt like a lie told well. The road down mountain unspooled with a fury I had to rein in because rolling a truck would serve nobody. In Lexington, the field office took the evidence with a caution that had nothing to do with disbelief. I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, I felt heat that would not dissipate, as if the mine had followed me out and was waiting for a chance to finish its sentence. The cabinets in that room were one set of cabinets in a region where rock and isolation are commodities employed by anyone who chooses. The conduit was cheap. The doors could be ordered. The Mountain S interior is a map that can be learned by those with time and the right anger. I still hear that place in quiet hours, the hum of lighting, a shuffle of paper, the careful steps of people who refuse to hurry because they have made the world a waiting room. Underground, time does not run, it collects. When it spills, it ruins more than your boots. Some minds hold coal, others hold intentions. If a tunnel is lit and no one will say why, assume the mountain has been rented to a purpose you won't want to learn. If these investigations unsettle you, remember to subscribe to Eerie Echoes. We have more ground to cover, and you want to walk it alone. Music in these mountains is inheritance. It teaches itself down bloodlines until hands know without asking. The night I stayed at my grandmother's homestead in late May, I learned the other half of that truth. Some songs inherit you. The cabin sits in a hollow called Devil's Backbone, a name nobody uses unless they have to mark a map. My grandmother left it to me with a letter that read like advice disguised as hospitality. It mentioned spring in terms of bloom and warned me lightly about nights when mountain laurel turned the ridges to pale fire. I arrived on a Friday with recording gear and a plan to capture ambient sound and maybe the echo of an old ballad if the valley had stored one in its ribs. Dusk in that place is a creature with a known route. Light climbs the opposite ridge and leaves the creek last. And when it goes full, the color of the world drops to a set you know only from memory. I set microphones near the porch and another in the yard, oriented toward the dark throat of the hollow. Night layered voice on voice, the creek first, then Katydid's tuning, then an owl whose call arrived like the punctuation point made by a truth telling itself. At 10, music joined them with a certainty that did not trip on being impossible. It began as a line so pure it felt like it had been shaved from bone. The instrument was a fiddle in the way a star is a fire. The tone carried more harmonics than wood and wire should hold. It slipped between trees and changed shape without losing itself. It braided familiar tunes into something that made them truer. Snatches of ballads my grandmother hummed while cooking slid through like creek stones seen under clear water. I adjusted levels with hands that had set gain 1,000 times and never on anything that felt like a visitor arriving without body. Distance collapsed. The melody moved closer without footsteps, circling the yard as if testing a fence. The porch boards carried weight without sound. My eyes recorded no one and nothing. The music began asking for more from me, and I realized only then that I had been holding breath since the first measure. When I tried to fill my chest, the air had the thickness of a church after a funeral, filled with what the living bring, waiting for release. I do not know when I stepped off the porch. The beam of my headlamp made a tunnel that contained only what it wanted to. The tunes strengthened in front of me, and a shape clarified at the limit of light, not quite silhouette, not quite man. The clothes insisted on another century without costuming. The hat brim refused to let the face belong to an age I could name. The fiddle held its own light, a shine more like a memory than a reflection. I saw hands draw the bow, and it felt obscene to witness. Some things are private even when they choose you. Compulsion is a quiet engine. It does not need words. I moved toward the music as if the terrain had been adjusted into a slope. Each footfall folded the world so that the cabin's hearthlight dulled, and the creek assy sentence shortened to a phrase and then to a single word repeated. The laurel breathed a powdery sweetness that rested against the tongue like the first lie you ever told yourself and believed. Underneath the melody, something else gathered. Voices that did not belong to a present, harmonies built from names I knew. The trick to surviving a pull is to find the knot you tied earlier without knowing why. Mine was my grandmother's letter. It had ended with a half joke about sleeping best when May was over, And suddenly I understood why a woman who never wasted a word had written that one. I turned, because turning is a skill you must keep oiled, and when the music protested, it did so by adding beauty the cruelest way. Inside, the recorder told me what my body already knew. The levels held. The capture was clean. The spectrogram showed frequencies I had not paid for. Beneath the main line, voices braided, a chorus of far, a texture of people not in rooms anymore. One line belonged to a tone I had grown up leaning into on summer afternoons. My grandmother's voice does not belong to any machine. It lives where breath and memory hold hands. That night, it held a note under a melody, and I decided that keeping the file would be an act of preservation with an edge I could not judge. I left before dawn. The road out felt longer because leaving felt like a betrayal and a rescue at once. I have not been back. The file remains in an archive that I do not open. I tell myself that music is a thing best heard alive or not at all, and that whatever I captured is neither. Some songs don't end, they ask you to. If you hear music moving around a house that sits where laurel blooms too well, count your reasons and choose the living one. I went into the Cherokee backcountry with gear that could talk to satellites and count my heartbeats. On the fourth night, everything that measured anything turned to theater, and the audience stepped closer. The test was supposed to be simple. 2 weeks alone in a grid square, the maps described as empty of trails. Proofing devices, the manufacturer said, were field agnostic and soldier-proof. Daylight proved them correct. The GPS drew my position with smug precision. The satellite communicator chirped cheerful delivery confirmations. The thermal scope made the night into a catalog of small fires. I built a camp with redundancies and slept with the low, satisfied readiness of a man in control of variables. At 3:17 a.m. I know the minute because the watch froze there and decided it was enough. Everything synchronized into failure. The GPS screen woke to a map of somewhere that was not North America and then died. The communicator powered but reported networks no human had arranged. The compass tried to be a child's toy, spinning uselessly. The altimeter told me I had summited and bottomed out within an hour without leaving my sleeping bag. I do not scare easily when equipment misbehaves. I scare when mechanical backups forget who they are. Morning did not repair confidence. Landmarks slid sideways in small, insulting ways. A distinctive split-trunk oak I had logged into my mental grid moved 30 yards from its own shadow. The creek I had been using flowed quieter and from a direction that made the map sulk. I navigated the day with stubbornness and a version of prayer that does not involve words, only repetition of action. By evening, I had the shape of a circle I had not intended to walk. Hunted is a strong word. Watched is worse. It began as the sensation of being the center of a radius and deepened into geometry. Movement, unsettled leaves without wind. Paths I had not cut appeared, precise and unhelpful. Night arrived asking for dues, and I paid by staying still longer than comfort allowed. When I finally lifted the night vision to my eyes, the world rearranged into an admission of what had been sharing space with me. Figures stood at the tree line and did not disturb it. They were tall by a measure my eyes didn't know how to use, their limbs proportional until motion proved otherwise. The devices drew them as temperatures and edges. The naked eye denied them with relief. Beyond, structures insisted on themselves briefly. Angles wrong for trees, planes that matched nothing wood grows into, frames that retreated when I blinked. I lowered the optic and the forest became honest again. I raised it and the truth returned like a lesson I had failed to study for. The gear did not simply fail, it collaborated. The GPS restarted and reported coordinates that listed through latitudes and longitudes like a slide carousel, stopping twice in oceans and once on a grid that did not belong to this planet. The communicator cracked open channels with strings of digits that mocked phone numbers and delivered audio that carried the cadence of language without any of its mercy. The thermal scope painted the watchers as lattices of heat, shifting tessellations. Not bodies at all, as I understand bodies. More like designs testing themselves. The message, if there was one, arrived in patience. They did not approach, threaten, or scatter when I moved. They adjusted the instruments the way a teacher adjusts a lab setup to ensure a student sees the principal at work. My fear subsided into a professional curiosity that lit up survival skills I did not know had dimmed. I began to record, annotate, and time. When the watch resumed of its own accord at dawn, the figures thinned and the trees exhaled. The remaining days became an exchange. My attempts to leave mapped onto trails that looped with elegance back to places I had named. Streams flowed where they chose. The sun lied politely. My notes filled with times, temperatures, angles, and the admission that the variables were not mine to hold. On the final morning, as if the test administrator had checked enough boxes, the woods normalized. The compass found north and looked ashamed. The GPS showed my camp as if it had never been anywhere else. The communicator delivered a backlog of messages from my team asking for the daily reports I had been sending, reports I had not written, in a tone that suggested I had been precise and cheerful the whole time. Back in the world, the footage refuses to settle. The optics captured what they wanted. The patterns remain on the screen even when I leave the room and come back trying to be a different person. The devices occasionally relapse into showing me their other vocabulary. Chords that sketch a constellation rather than a route. Notifications from senders that have too many numbers and no names, small thermal ghosts blooming for a second where no warm thing is. I have learned not to test the phenomena by invitation. I have learned to carry paper maps and to trust them less than I trust my feet. There is a version of this experience where contact is a handshake and wonder wins. This was not that version. It was a lesson in the limits of measurement and the courtesy of being examined by something that could have been cruel and chose not to be, this time. Technology is a language we mistake for truth. In those hills, I met fluent speakers of another dialect entirely, and they were kind enough to grade my accent. If these Appalachian accounts left a cold edge on your breath, don't walk the next ridge alone. Subscribe to Eerie Echoes for more true horror from the oldest mountains in America. New stories arrive soon, quiet, patient, and closer than they were yesterday.